Hello, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Just going to give it a minute while we wait for people to join. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome, welcome if you're just arriving. Just going to give it another moment or two before we get started here. All right, well, it looks like attendance is leveling off, so I think we can get started. Welcome to Handling Photographs for Digitization. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA, and I use he and they pronouns. For visual accessibility, I will say I'm a white person with glasses, headphones, and a blue shirt, and my background is blurred. So just a bit more about our webinar today. Digitization is an important step in improving access to your photography collection while simultaneously minimizing the frequency of handling that can potentially cause damage to these items. Today, Digital Archive Specialist Kaitlyn Pettengill will be in conversation with Associate Photo Conservator Ivey Barker to discuss the unique challenges of working with photographs in achieving your digitization goals. They will discuss the differences in digitization setups for a range of photographic materials, including case photographs, glossy prints, and slides. Considerations of various photographic formats, materials, and vulnerabilities will help participants shape an effective digitization strategy. And you will come away with more information on how to safely implement digitization setups based on your scale and budget, as well as an understanding of which photo processes to prioritize for digitization. So before we turn it over to them, just some Zoom housekeeping. You are in Zoom webinar, so your video and your audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. This program is auto-closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. We'll have the presentations from our speakers today, followed by Q&A with you, but please feel free to ask questions anytime, and I will be reading those questions off at the end as they come in. The program is being recorded, and we'll send a recording as well as the PowerPoint and any other resources we may have shared in a follow-up email. And just we wanted to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for generously sponsoring this program. I'm just gonna just one quick note about the organization that we work for, CCHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based here in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, of course, documents, artworks on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do at ccaha.org. So just a quick note about our speakers. As Associate Photo Conservator, Ivey Barker assesses the condition and treatment needs for a wide range of photographs, from daguerreotypes to digital prints, and contributes to outreach efforts. Ivey joins the staff from the Cleveland Museum of Art, where she was the Mellon Fellow in Photograph Conservation. She has held positions at the National Archives and Records Administration, the Image Permanence Institute, and the George Eastman Museum. Ivey received an MA in Photographic Preservation and Collections Management from the University of Rochester in collaboration with the George Eastman Museum. And then as the Digital Archive Specialist, Kaitlyn Pettengill conducts digital preservation assessments and assists with digitization planning for collecting organizations. She advises organizations in the ongoing development, implementation, and operation of their digital preservation programs, as well as on recommendations for the development and implementation of digital preservation strategies, technologies, and procedures. Prior to joining the CCHA staff in 2024, Kaitlyn worked as the digital projects coordinator for the Atwater Kent collection at Drexel University and as the digital services archivist at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Kaitlyn earned an MLIS from San Jose State University, where she specialized in digital collections and digital asset management. She also holds an MA in History of Art from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and a BA in Art History and English Literature from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, PA. So now I will turn it over to our speakers, starting with Ivey to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to partner with Kaitlyn on this very apt and important webinar for accessibility purposes. I'm a white female with blonde hair and glasses, and my background Zoom is a collection of different brass mats that can be found in cased photographs, such as daguerreotypes and ambrotypes. Next slide. Next slide, please. So we want to discuss the framing the problem for handling photographs for digitization. Photographs can be incredibly complex to digitize, especially those with reflective surfaces or high gloss surfaces, or that are housed in exterior cases like daguerreotypes, which also have a mirrored surface, and ambrotypes. The risk of loss is not always obvious. It depends on the types of materials used to create that photographs, the different emulsion types, and the color stability. It's not always true that the oldest photographs are the most vulnerable. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this webinar. Capturing an accurate image can also be difficult because photos on paper tend to curl or have a little plano distortion, which can be a little bit difficult to focus on to get an accurate image, along with other factors that Kaitlyn will cover later on. Digitization can increase the risk factor for damage if materials are not handled correctly. I'm hoping the audience can take away some great tips and tricks that they can utilize in their collections to mitigate or prevent any additional damages to photographs that might be in a vulnerable or potentially vulnerable state before digitization. And of course, the goal is to expand access while minimizing the handling of the original objects. Expanding access is specific to your organization and what that means, whether you're trying to provide images for resources or internal cataloging or publication. Next slide. This is one of my favorite websites. It was developed at the Image Permanence Institute, and it is jam-packed full of amazing information. It is free to access, Graphics Atlas, and it is in the resources links at the end of the webinar for you to explore. This website allows you to select specific photographs, zoom in on them. It gives you deterioration types, characteristics to look for identification, and a wide range of information if you're unsure of what type of photograph you have, or you're unsure how to correctly house it, and whether it needs to be put on your prioritization list for digitization based on common deterioration types. Next slide. So during this webinar, we're talking about photographs. That encompasses 19th century to the present. That includes case photographs like daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, prints, and albums that are on paper base, and photographic negatives that can be glass, film-based, and common photographic supports include metal, glass, paper, and plastics. So as you can see, there's a wide range of sizes, formats, and materialities in photographs that make it difficult and complex to decide how and when and what to use during the digitization process. Next slide. This is a timeline for early or cased photographic processes, mostly cased objects. Tin types can be in cases or not in cases. You can also find this on the Graphics Atlas and explore more about their commonalities, characteristics, and inherent vices. Next slide. This timeline is a quick and dirty for print on paper. I'm sorry that this image is a little off. I'll try and fix that before it goes out. But what are common prints on paper that might be found in collections leading from the 1840s up into the digital age and beyond? Next slide. And this timeline includes negative supports and where they fall in the photographic history and timeline and what types of supports those would be, whether they're metal, glass, paper, film. To give you a screenshot of what you're looking at as a comparison. Next slide. So photos, as we see, have a lot of varied materials that can either work well together or work against each other based on their chemical components. Some common vulnerabilities in photos include surface sensitivity, the emulsions and coatings starting to separate from their metal or paper supports, as we see on the far left with the baby. Structural fragility, which is very common in glass plate negatives, are glass bases that often require special housing or very complex housing solutions for treatment and safety and storage in order to be accessible or provide accessibility in the future. And of course, chemical instability, because it's a silver halide process and there's a lot of chemical components. If it isn't processed right in the dark room or isn't fixed right, or the color chemistry was still being worked out, shout out the 1960s color photos, then you can see very distinct chemical deterioration, such as color fading and mirroring or silver mirroring, as you see here on the far right. Next. So let's go over the common risks and red flags that you need to be aware of in your photographic collections in order to make informed, safe, and appropriate digitization decisions. They can encompass three main categories. They can be physical risks of the photographs, chemical, or biological. And this photo on this screen is showing staining from adhesive or tape from a temporary fix. Next. So common deteriorations that you might come across in your collections that fall into the physical category are flaking or lifting of the emulsions or coatings, tears and distortions or separation of the paper supports, are mounted board supports, adhesive tape, abrasion, which is scratches, and staining. And of course, broken or missing components, which is very common with cased objects in old hinges that the adhesive has desiccated or dried up to the point that it has become detached. Next slide. Common deterioration types that fall into the chemical components include silver mirroring, as we discussed, and that is for silver halide-based photographs. Staining of the supports, Fading, yellowing, and color shifts are dye couple fading in the colorants of color photos. And of course, metal and glass corrosion or deterioration from inferior or old materials that were used at the beginning of the photographic boom. This chart from the Graphics Atlas, IPI, and RIT is great in showing the differences in identifying the difference between color shifting, which is when one color, CMYK, say cyan, the blue, fades quicker than the magenta and yellow. So you end up with a full yellow photograph or a full magenta photograph because one of those colors has faded quicker than the others. Highlighting yellowing in the papers, image ghosting, which is the transfer of images to thin paper interleaving. This is very common with like platinum prints, and image fading altogether. Next slide. Next, the common deterioration biological. This is both a risk to your photo and potentially a risk to your health. It encompasses exterior forces that have impacted your photos. Mostly that is due to environment or high humidity that can cause mold growth, leading to image loss or emulsion loss, discoloration, and sometimes insect infestations can leave evidence of holes or additional losses. These should be set aside and assessed in a meaningful manner, ideally isolated away from other collections that don't present these types of damage issues. Next. Handling. Always wear gloves with photos, please. Nitrile is our glove of choice. And the reason for that is the salt and oils from hands can cause almost immediate damage to many surfaces of photographs, whether that's an imprinted fingerprint because your hand is hot and you're heating up the gelatin and it imprints. Tarnishing, the oils and salts can cause discoloration over time. There's many distinguishable deterioration types that are caused from handling photos with bare hands. With that, even if you're wearing gloves, we strongly recommend that to handle photos along the edges and not in the interior to the point that's safe. Next slide. Working with photos. Always use two hands. Work over a table. Avoid flexing and turn carefully. Do not stack or flatten distorted photos that can't easily be flattened or are resisting. And keep objects covered and labeled when in use. I did bring some samples. So if you have a photo that is in deteriorated state or you're having a hard time carrying it with two hands, I do recommend having some sort of rigid board support like this that you can put the photo on to carry it to your bench. When it's talking about turning carefully, there is a solution to that as well when you're handling some damaged photos that are still able to be digitized safely, but may need extra attention and handling and care. So I have this photo on a whiteboard, and it also has writing on the back. So it has a rigid support, even though it has quite a lot of tears. And these are all study collection items, which is why I'm not wearing gloves. So after you photograph the front, If you put another piece or board on top, then you can gently flip it over, and then you're ready to digitize all the inscriptions on the back of the photo. Next one. This is particularly geared toward things like glass plate negatives and film-based negatives to avoid abrasion or scratching on the surface. If you're housing them in these paper envelopes, which is great, avoid reaching into the envelope and pulling them out with that tension. Instead, pour the item into your hand and remove any cover sheet material by lifting and not sliding. Next slide. So, a photo conservator's joy is albums and scrapbooks, because not only do you have the complexity of photos, but now you get into the complexity of book structures, paper materials, newspaper scraps. So how do we deal with that as conservators in digitization? Do not force an album or scrapbook to lay flat. The best way is to support the structure, whether that's a scrapbook or album, with cradles or wedges where it wants to gently open, and then just wait that. And then you can set up your system to photograph it in that situation. Turn pages carefully and safeguard with interleaving. So an interleaving is a very thin sheet of paper that passes the photographic activity test that can be placed in between two pages of scrapbooks. So photos aren't coming into direct contact with each other face to face, which can cause them to potentially stick together, causing more damage if they're in high humidity situations. It just mitigates some very hard damages to remediate or treat in the future. And of course, if there's any loose content, I would house those in nice outer housings like polyester sleeves and just put them in where they were. So you have the continued knowledge of where they came from, so you can photograph them along with the content to keep the story of the album or scrapbook. And I see I have a question. Let's see if I answered that. If the photographs are securely attached to the scrapbook pages, we will not attempt to remove them. Uh, it causes, it is very time consuming and often does not result in the success rate that the client or conservator would like to see, and most likely causes damage to the paper pages, as well as creates a space where those photos will get separated from each other and lose the overall story of the scrapbook and album. So we try and keep pages of scrapbooks intact with the photos that are already attached to them. Can we put a non-glare glass sheet on top of photo? I'm unsure what that means.
Ivy, don't worry about that one too much. I'll tackle that later on.
Okay. Yes, I think I did answer
Absolutely.
most of that. Okay, next slide. So how to prepare the original objects. I would like to stress that to have a good foundational knowledge, your collection is organized, you have a system of labeling that you understand, and you're able to identify the types of photographs in your collection, either with your foundational knowledge or referring to sources like Graphics Atlas, so you can better understand their proclivities, vulnerabilities, and inherent vices. With that, combined with that, doing a condition assessment to divide photographs that need extra attention, need to be isolated due to mold, need to receive some sort of treatment before it can be digitized, or are known to deteriorate faster than others. So you can create prioritizations and objectives for your digitization workflow and future procedures. Yes, if you have storage space, our lack of storage space, removing slides from their original carousels can free up space, but you have to have a very stringent documentation and labeling process, so you know exactly what order those slides came out of, so you can put them back in the carousels. So this is you can, but it might cause more time and energy than just leaving them.
Just
in
to
the-
Yeah.
not just to insert for a minute, I'm sorry, Ivy, but there's no conservation reason to not leave slides in the carousels, correct?
No.
As long as they're covered and there's no dust getting in, they're safe in those carousels long term.
And
Yes, as long as the environmental controls are sufficient and you're doing periodic checks. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Just a reminder to our speakers that there's a lot of questions coming in, and we can definitely save those to the end. But please, everybody, keep those questions coming in to the comments, and we will make sure to address them towards the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Next slide.
Did you say next slide, Ivy?
Yes. So when to unframe. You see these examples here. Generally, you're going to want to unframe photos if they're endangered, like the photos are slipping through here and can potentially have more tears and scratches. They are slated for treatment, or they need some sort of intervention, or they're like stuck to the cover glass and you need to consult a conservator to remove that safely, or they need to be removed so a facsimile print or an exhibition print can be printed for alternative needs that wouldn't use the original. Next slide. Now back to albums. This is always a tricky question. When to disbind an album. It's a collaborative decision. Albums are unique because the whole thing is an object and tells a specific story. So we try to keep albums in their original structure as much as possible. Possible reasons to alter formats, either temporarily or permanently, would be the contents are unsafe. Say the binding is just riddled with mold, etc., and you need to remove it to isolate it before it causes more damage to neighboring collection items. It can't be rebound. It needs treatment, or it needs digitization, in which treatment and digitization, they would be temporarily disbound for ease of documentation, but then put back into their original order in the album. Next slide. Now we're going to go to Kaitlyn and her wisdom on digitization and learn all about what photos need on that end.
Thank you so much, Ivy. Yeah. So because I didn't get a chance to do it earlier, just for accessibility's sake, I will say that I am a white woman with blonde hair wearing headphones and a kind of tan sweater. And my background is the painted backdrops that you would see in 19th century photo studios. So if you're looking through old photographs and you notice that everyone's posing in front of some sort of elaborate painted backdrop, that's what I have behind me here. And let me know, please, if it's interfering with anything. But I don't have any fun items with me in person to show off the way that Ivy did. So it'll just be the PowerPoint. But setting up the work area when you're going to start digitizing, workspace essentials, I want to spend a moment to talk about that area itself. The goal is simple. You're trying to move the photograph through the workflow with as little handling as possible while still obviously supporting it. A clean, smooth surface will help to prevent any kind of abrasion. And you want to make sure that you have enough space to work. Makes a much bigger difference than a lot of people realize. The federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative, which is FAGI, they suggest that you have a workspace that is roughly 6 times the size of the object, which obviously if you're dealing with a giant poster, that can be really hard to achieve. But with most photographs, unless they're panoramas or something truly massive, you should be able to have about that much space in order to work, at least. It starts to sound excessive, but when you are adding in all of your supports, labels, and any kind of documentation that you need to have, like you've got a pencil, you've got a notebook, you've got your computer, you really do want to make sure that you have enough space that nothing is being knocked off accidentally. And it also helps to create a clear in, imaging, and out zone so that materials are moving through the process in an organized way and you're not mixing anything up. You want to remember the environment. You need to avoid any kind of direct sunlight. Obviously, light exposure is one of the major threats to photographs, as Ivy's talked about. Also, you want to avoid any kind of strong airflow coming from vents or HVAC systems and any kind of dust. Even if a photograph is only out for a few minutes, it's worth creating a condition that really is going to minimize risk. So the good workflow starts before your camera or your scanner is ever turned on. Next slide, please, Greg. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 major setups. One of the things you'll notice throughout my section is there isn't one perfect digitization setup. The best choice is going to depend on the format, type of photograph. Obviously, there's a huge number of different types of photos that have been produced throughout the years. The condition of it, the size, any kind of surface characteristics, and your goals for the project, what you need to have the image represent. So generally speaking, there's 3 major categories. There's the flatbed scanners that I have there in the middle. There's the camera and copy stand setup on the left, and any kind of specialized equipment like the slide scanner that you can see on the right. Each one is going to have some strengths and some limitations, and each one works better for certain types of materials. So the key is matching the setup to the object rather than trying to force all of your objects into the same workflow just because it's what you already have available to you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to focus on the camera and the copy stand first, because if I could have only one digitization setup for a mixed photograph collection that has a lot of different types, it would probably be the camera and copy stand. It's incredibly flexible. It works well for fragile, oversized, reflective, or layered materials. And because nothing is pressing down on the object, it's often the safest option from a preservation standpoint. So people will ask whether a scanner or a copy stand produces better images, and the answer is that it depends on the object. So a stable modern print might scan really beautifully on a flatbed, but once you're dealing with the albums, the cased photographs, mounted prints, lantern slides, anything that's a little bit more fragile or that has some level of depth to it, that's sort of 3D, the copy stand often becomes the better choice, not just for preservation, but also to get the best image that most reflects the actual item in front of you. So another advantage of the camera copy stand setup is adaptability. For prints, you're using reflected light. For negatives or transparencies or lantern slides, you can introduce transmitted light from below by using a light box, which you can purchase pretty cheaply from somewhere like Michael's. And the same setup can handle a wide range of formats as long as you have the scannable area or the photography. The area that you are able to cover. So basically the size of the copy stand and how much that the camera is able to capture. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the types of photographs that Ivey's already covered, but from the standpoint of getting a good image. So it's case photographs. You can see that they've photographed this item as a case photograph. They have not separated it out. They've left the case in place. They can be very challenging to digitize because of those reflective surfaces. If you've ever tried to photograph something like a daguerreotype or a photograph that has the glass in place, and it's not always perfectly straight. Sometimes it might have a little bit of a curve to it. You've probably discovered that these will behave more like a mirror than like a photograph. You're going to get a lot of reflections. And that's the biggest challenge, is controlling those reflections. So the image that I have here on this slide, it is actually the exact same case photograph, just imaged in slightly different ways. And you can see that the image on the right is much clearer, and you're not getting that reflection like you are on the left. So one common approach is to surround the object with a black foam board or black paper or a black cloth, leaving a small opening for the camera lens. It's sort of, I guess I'd say like it's a version of the pinhole camera, but obviously you're using it for different reasons. This will reduce any unwanted reflections, and it helps the image itself to stand out. So there you can see the two different setups with that same photograph. Lighting placement also really matters. You want to make sure to position any kinds of lights that you have with you at 45-degree angles that can really reduce the glare while still providing good illumination. And finally, with a camera or an SLR, you want to make sure that you are focusing carefully. The camera might try and focus on the glass, but what you're interested in, obviously, is the image underneath the glass. So make sure that you're focusing on that and not on the glass right in front. And that link at the bottom is it's from Brown University, and there's more information there on getting a good image of a mirrored surface. Next slide, please. All right, glass plate negatives. They often contain really remarkable detail, but they require really careful handling. If your collection has both glass plate negatives and positive prints, in order to get the best image, I would recommend digitizing the negative as long as they're in a good enough condition that you can do that. Because any positive prints made from the glass plate negatives are going to be limited to the quality of the print itself. So you'll get more detail, and you'll be able to get really, really in there and be able to see everything that's recorded in the negative by digitizing the negative itself rather than the positive print. So the image-bearing emulsion layer is vulnerable to abrasion. You need to be very careful. You can very carefully remove dust from the glass side, but cleaning the emulsion side needs to be avoided unless you're a trained conservator like Ivey. So you can use either a flatbed scanner that's capable of scanning from transparencies. If you have a flatbed Epson, they're kind of the workhorse of digitization. They are able to handle something like a glass plate negative, but obviously it has to adjust because the glass plate is, again, 3D. It's not perfectly flat. You can also use the copy stand with transmitted light. So you can get good images from both of those. And then I'll get into it later on in the presentation, but obviously if you're scanning the negative, it's hard for the human eye to really read that image and understand it. So you can invert that digitally to create a positive version, the kind of print version, as your access image. And you can also increase contrast to make details easier to see, but any kind of significant changes that you're making need to be documented. All right, next slide, please. All right, lantern slides. These two are actually from my own collection. It's a Springbok. They use many of the same digitization techniques as glass plate negatives. But one thing that you want to keep in mind is the mount itself. So on this one, you can see that there's a label that says the Springbok on it. Sometimes they'll see a date, or if they were mass produced lantern slides, there might be the photographer or the manufacturer. Handwritten notes, all of that is really useful context about how the slide was used. That's important to understand the slide. So you don't just want to capture that photograph, you want to capture the whole slide as it is. So you want to get that surrounding frame as well. And there's two ways to go about doing that. You can either use the camera and put it onto a light box where you can use the camera to capture both simultaneously, or if you're using a flatbed, which is what I did to get these two images, you can create one where you're focusing on the you've set it up for a reflective surface, and you've got the frame in there, and you've got the image, the photograph there, and they've been captured with different settings, and then you can digitally combine them. But you're just going to make sure that if you do that, that again, it's recorded. Any changes like that need to be recorded. All right, moving on to the next one. Right, as Ivy said, albums are more than just collections of photographs, right? They are really wonderful documents that somebody's put together. They've put everything in order the way that they want it. They've put in labels maybe, and the album itself is one single object. So the captions, the sequencing, the annotations, the physical arrangements, they're all intentional and they all carry meaning. And the album itself is an artifact that we need to preserve. So people will ask if photographs should be removed before digitization, and in almost every case, I would say that the answer is no. Ivy did talk about some reasons that you might need to for preservation purposes, but if it's just about the digitization, it's more important to preserve the structure and the context of the album when possible. If some photos are loose, you can get a high resolution flatbed scan because that photo's already kind of kicking around inside the album. But don't take out photos if they're attached either by glue or by those little adhesive corners. It's just too easy to do damage. And instead, yes, use those cradles and those wedges to support the volume to open it safely without forcing the pages flat. You can use something like a snake weight, or a sheet of glass or something like that if you really need to weigh it down gently. But if you can get a good image without doing that, that's also great, because it's important to capture both the images here and the relationships between them. Right. Next slide. So this slide illustrates why surface characteristics matter. These prints may contain similar image content, but they interact with light differently. Glossy surfaces can produce reflections and glare. Matte surfaces behave differently. Some processes may show the iridescence or other optical effects. And a technically sharp image isn't necessarily an accurate one if important surface characteristics are going to disappear during the digitization process. So when we're digitizing the photographs, we're documenting both the image content and the physical qualities of the object itself. It's the kind of constant battle in digitizing. Are you capturing the information on the page, or are you capturing the artifact itself? And really, it should be both. Ivy, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or?
No, there are some additional specialized setups that can mitigate some of these, what we call light flares that you're seeing in this high gloss photograph, using diffuse light, umbrellas, different ways of mitigating to get your desired results during the digitization process. This is an hour webinar, but there will be another webinar discussing more in depth about things like that.
Thank you. Yes, and again, you want to make sure that that surface is recorded. It's an important part of the object itself. Next slide. So getting into flatbeds a little bit, they are still an excellent option for many photographic materials. You can get sometimes a much higher resolution. They are particularly useful for stable flat prints, for certain negatives and slides where you have a transparency unit available. You can see that they're in the top image of the flatbed scanner and then taken out on the bottom, so where you'd put the negatives in. They provide consistent lighting. They're predictable. Sometimes if you are having to adjust a camera manually, there's changes that are going to occur, just human differences to the lighting in the room itself. So the scanner, the flatbed can make the workflow easier to manage because it is more predictable the way that it's going to react. One practical question we hear a lot is how to remove photographs safely from the flatbed. That was something that was sent in. If you see a question here in the little yellow bubble at the bottom of the slides, that was a question that one of the attendees provided to us. Thank you very much for everyone who sent in questions. Of course, though, you can ask them along now as you have been doing. So yes, how to safely remove or pick up the photographs from the flatbed without doing any kind of damage. You don't want to slide them because sliding can create abrasion. Instead, you kind of want to get it straight up as much as possible while supporting it during removal. I will sometimes use the corner of an index card to help me. So as long as you can be carefully get under there, the index card is not going to scratch the glass on a flatbed, and as long as the photo itself is not flaking or fragile in any way, in which case you shouldn't be putting it on the flatbed. But yeah, the index card can just kind of slip under there, and you can use that to help you lift it. All right, next slide, please. Stereograph cards. I'm going to guess that some of you have these in your collection. I love them. They are, designed to create a 3D effect when put into a stereo viewer, but many of them have a curvature or a distortion to them, but that was intentional in order to help your brain read the image better when it was in the stereoscope. So that's not something that is, due to what we would call slumpage because it was in boxes and it was, forced over. That's not what this is from. This is not a problem. This is inherent to how the object is meant to be. So you don't want to force them flat under a scanner lid. You can try and very gently lower the lid, but if the card is fragile and you're worried about forcing that curve at all, then the copy stand and the camera is probably the safer choice. So for access purposes, institutions will sometimes create separate images between the left and the right view. They're slightly different so that it actually works when you're kind of, looking at it. So they are not exactly the same. If you are publishing one of them, I would always specify which one it is and that it came from a stereoscope, just so that people understand the context. And it's important to preserve that original paired image because of, the relationship. It's part of the important historical context of a stereograph card. So yes, it's only for access copies that you would want to create the two separate left and right images. I'll get into this a little bit more in a few slides, but the difference is the preservation images. Those are, the raw files from your camera. They're the TIFF files from your flatbed. They're the non-compressed or losslessly compressed images that are a much higher resolution usually. They are the long-term preserved or master copies of the images. And then the access images are the ones that you can share on social media, or you can easily put into email to send to a researcher, or you can provide through the public side of a digital library. Maybe you're using something like Omeka. And so the access copy, you don't want it to be a huge file. Something like a JPEG is easier to share. And that's when you can make these changes that I'm talking about for readability, like only using the left or the right image, or creating that inverted version, or up in contrast, or if you're able to kind of repair some of the color changes a little bit, but you always want to make sure that you're specifying like what you did so that anybody looking at that image understands the changes that you've made, and just be transparent about it. Right, moving on to the next slide. So specialized equipment. These can be really useful if you're trying to take care of a large number of slides or transparencies or negatives. It can just really speed up your workflow, but they're only really good for that type of material. So if you have a very limited budget, again, I wouldn't go with specialized equipment. I would go with the camera and copy stand, and if you can, a good flatbed. Another question that I hear a lot is when outsourcing is more economical than trying to purchase equipment. So a good rule of thumb there to consider is scale. If you're digitizing thousands of slides every year, maybe you have a huge number of artists' collections from a time period where they would have been creating slides of their work, or you have a university collection that was, the art library, and you're just dealing with thousands of slides, then investing in the equipment might make sense. But if you only have one cabinet of slides and you might not see another collection come in containing slides, for years, then outsourcing is often the more practical option. The decision isn't just about the equipment, it's also, the staff time and the training and the maintenance and the overall workflow. And then when you get into things like AV and very slight changes in the material type means an entirely different setup, it can just be more economical to go to a vendor. Next slide, please. All right, image quality considerations. This is one of the most common digitization questions. How much resolution is enough? You can't just maximize it for everything because you're going to end up with a truly enormous number of high resolution slides and you're going to run out of storage very quickly. So the answer really depends on what you're trying to capture. So what I've done here is I've done scans of both a handwritten letter and that lantern slide that I showed you before, and I've done them at these different resolutions and with an increasing amount of color information. So text often reaches a point where adding additional resolution is adding very little value. Once it's readable, increasing the file size doesn't necessarily improve access. Maybe if you want to blow up a picture of the Constitution and put it in your elevator at a library, there'd be some reason for a very particular one-off situation. Maybe you want to do it at a very high resolution, but you're not really getting more information for your users. But photos are different because they contain very subtle tonal transitions. There's fine detail. There's visual information that can really benefit from that higher resolution and that greater bit depth. So that doesn't mean that the highest possible settings are always the best choice, because again, those larger files require far more storage and more processing time. A scanner takes a lot longer to do a high resolution image. It's going to slow you down. So the goal isn't to create the biggest file possible, but it's to create the file that captures that information that you need for this particular project, this particular item, for preservation and for access long term. Next slide, please. Okay. Photographs are physical objects. As Ivey's been talking about, they are made up in so many different ways. They are the emulsion layer on top of the base, and it's going to each one's going to be very different. Close-up documentation can sometimes help you to identify the photographic processes, deterioration, like little surface characteristics that are difficult to see in the full object image. So what I have on this slide is an autochrome from the Library of Congress collection. You can see that there's the girl there who's holding like a butterfly net. That's the full image. And then you see the close-up, because an autochrome is actually made up of dyed potato starch granules, which gives the image this really beautiful kind of pointillist character to it. And that magnified image shows you that makeup. That's an important part of the autochrome. And that extreme close-up of certain types of photographs might reveal more information, or silver mirroring or cracking evidence that helps you to understand potential damage that is occurring as well. So these high resolution images in this case can be incredibly valuable later for research, for conservation treatment, for exhibitions. There's no one set rule for how you want to go about digitizing your collections. Next slide, please. All right, I mentioned this a little bit, but the post-processing, you've got that preservation image here. That's the top one. That's the original negative. And you want to keep that as unedited as possible. You want to leave a small border around it so that anyone looking at it can understand the full object. In the case of this glass plate negative, you can see that there's a little bit of chipping happening. The access copy is the one at the bottom. It can be lightly edited for clarity. You can create that inverted version. You can, increase contrast. But you want to make sure that all of those edits are very clearly documented in the metadata attached to that item and in the description so that you remember, and the people who work at the collection after you remember that you made those edits, and so that anyone viewing it as a researcher or a patron or a student, that they understand the differences between the original object in front of you and the access copy you've provided. Great. Next slide, please. So what to prioritize for digitization? Most organizations don't have the time or the resources to digitize everything, so prioritization is really important. As Ivy and I have both talked about today, fragile formats, actively deteriorating photographs, and unstable formats, things like Polaroids, are really strong candidates because digitization can reduce further handling, and it's also preserving whatever information you can before any kind of additional loss occurs. I'd also put high use collections at the top of the list because if researchers are requesting the same materials really repeatedly, digitization can improve access while reducing the wear on the originals. You can keep them off show and just give the researchers a really good digital copy. So if you're not sure where to start, look for your materials that are the most vulnerable, the most heavily used, or would be the hardest to replace in some way. And these are your best candidates. Right, moving on to the final slide here. Sensitivities of photographic prints. I'm going to tap Ivy back in here in a moment, but one thing I am asked about sometimes is if I'm digitizing this, I'm going to have to be using, a scanner or strong light. Am I doing damage while I'm digitizing? And is that worse than just kind of leaving it be in the dark? Photographic damage is cumulative. As the examples in the slide show, different combinations of light level and exposure time can result in the same overall exposure. But one of the benefits of digitization is that you're reducing the display of the original. And so maybe it's worth it to have this kind of one-time exposure in order to keep things, out of the light for the future. So you still want to be very thoughtful and use controlled lighting and efficient workflows because the faster you are while safely doing things, the faster that object is back out of the light. Ivy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so this is a key example that older photographs aren't necessarily the most vulnerable or need to be prioritized the most quickly. But it does give you an indication on their sensitivity level specifically to light in this chart, but it does hold up for other deterioration types. I will say in the previous slide that Kaitlyn covered, yes, you should prioritize photographs that have some sort of damage, but there are levels of damage that are safe if your photographs are just starting to flake or have some minor cracks, but are still stable and aren't flaking off and you're not actively losing emulsion, then you can digitize them safely. Otherwise, I strongly encourage heavier levels of flaking and cracking and tears to be treated first, have conservation intervention before digitization, so you're not potentially causing more damage via handling and digitization than you would otherwise.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, if you worry that you can't touch it without losing some kind of information, then yes, it should definitely see a conservator before you're trying to do anything else. All right. Next slide. Okay. Personally, I want to leave you with a few takeaways. The first is to identify the format before handling it. Different photographic processes have different structures, different vulnerabilities, and from the digital archivist side of things, it has different capture needs. Second, stabilize before digitizing. Digitization should never create new damage. It should only help you to prevent future damage. And third, match the setup to the object rather than trying to fit every object into your existing workflow. So, as I said, photographs are both information and artifacts, and successful digitization records both of those things while still minimizing risk to the original.
All right. Well, thank you, Kaitlyn. Can everybody hear me? Is my audio coming through? Okay, good. So we're just about at time, but I think we can stick around and maybe ask or answer at least a few of the
Sure.
questions that have come in. We might only get to three or four because y'all had a lot of questions, which is great. But please follow up. We can share emails and stuff in the chat and later if you want to follow up directly with any of us about questions. I see our very first question, at least that I noticed content-wise coming in the chat, is why do you recommend nitrile gloves versus cotton gloves?
Great question. Nitrile gloves tend to fit better. They come in various different sizes and they have a gripability that cotton gloves don't. Cotton gloves are often ill-fitting and slippery. In addition to that, corners of photographs that are torn or glass plates that have rough edges, the grip and the hold of the nitrile gloves helps, and cotton gloves can get caught on any edge tears or broken glass. That can potentially lead to more tearing or even dropping of the object. I know that cotton gloves are more sustainable, um, but you have less flexibility and control via grip, fit, and damage mitigation.
To add to that, just one other thing, which was, well, two. Cotton fibers, depending on how dirty the collection is that you might be working with, they can transfer dirt. And once they're in there between the fibers and the cotton, you're spreading them to the next object. I would also say that I think we have a webinar with preservation specialist Katie Lowe all about gloves that is either available already on our YouTube page or will be shortly, that is going to do a whole deep dive into what gloves for what objects and when clean, dry hands are best. Obviously, it depends on the item that you're working with.
Yes, that's our Glove Actually webinar, which is available on our YouTube. Yeah, let's see. This question I think came in, Ivy, when you were talking about the flipping of photographs. How do you handle flipping of photographs that are unable to be flattened? So like maybe those stereo photographs that Kaitlyn was showing or something.
So, photographs that are unable to be flattened, um, but would be ready for digitization. So they have a slight curvature. I would use something like a very thick mylar support to then lift it, like Kaitlyn was saying, in the best way. Use a rigid support and then gently lift it on the edges that have the least amount of damage with that.
Thank you. I think this was also kind of in the when we were talking about scrapbooks and things like that. Those 70s photo albums that have the
Yeah.
sticky pages that you just stick the photos to. What are your recommendations there in terms of
Magnetic albums. um, So, yes, the front plastic coverings can be rolled back for you to get better imaging quality from the photographs through digitization and either replaced and put back in the original condition, or if you're not super tied to those old plastic sheetings on the front, then there is a product called silicone release paper or silicone release film that you can use for interleaving between those pages so they're not sticking together, but they can promote still you being able to access those photos. If this is a personal album, it's up to you whether you would like to keep those photos in that order. If this is a collection album, I would recommend interleaving with silicone release. If you don't have all the original coverings or they're in terrible condition and for some reason aren't serving the purpose of the magnetic album.
So, Ivy, what would you do? So there's like kind of two types of sticky photograph albums that I'm thinking of. The one that was intentional, sort of the cling film that was intended to stick to the photos and keep them in place. And then the ones that have come through plasticine migration become really sticky or tacky. What would you recommend then, having a conservator remove things, or would it be something that somebody might be able to safely do themselves depending on the condition?
Because albums are very tricky, I would advise asking conservator their thoughts, and maybe they have a good solution for you or some tips and tricks we often use with magnetic albums if we have to remove photos for some reason. Yeah, they're not my favorite, but they're better than the black paper. So
Yeah.
there's that.
I think I'm going to skip ahead just to some of the questions that are more in Kaitlyn's wheelhouse, just to make sure that you get some questions, Kaitlyn, around the actual scanning portion. Um, since scanners typically illuminate photographs for a briefer period than overhead lighting with camera stand, would you agree that the scanners provide less light exposure than overhead cameras?
Oh gosh. I mean, I suppose there's that. It's the cumulative thing again. I feel like this is still somewhat in Ivy's wheelhouse. Yes, I suppose that could be true, but I'm concerned more about whether something even outside of the light could safely be put onto the flatbed surface and with the lid closed to the degree that you can get a decent scan. Because if you are trying to do it very carefully, but that means you're creating multiple scans in order to get a decent image, you've kind of negated any gain that you've had. Does that make sense? The more that you're able to do it as a kind of a one and done instead of playing around, the better, really.
Yeah, flatbed scanners are best for flat materials. So this would be materials that are in good shape, have fairly flat planarity, or can easily be flattened with a very lightweight, like a small plexi or something like that, to assist with digitization and getting the best picture. And then with different types of damage, planal distortions and stuff, then you're going to select different setups that aid you in getting the best picture for that format and damage structure.
I mean, if it's a case where the photograph is structurally sound, it's the backing is good, nothing is flaking off, something like, I guess, a Polaroid, and you are more concerned about the light exposure than anything else. I mean, I would still be putting it on a flatbed because the Polaroid can handle a flatbed, and that's how you're going to get the best image. And it is a situation where you're creating a good enough scan that you can then have a facsimile, whether it be digital or printed, that you're giving to researchers instead. It's worth that small amount of potential light damage in order to remove the object from light in the future and get rid of that potential damage, long term.
I agree. If you're planning ahead and doing it one time really well, then that exposure cumulatively is much less than additional exposures to digitization when you didn't do it correctly the first
Mm.
time?
And I think just because we're running out of time, I just want to take one more question. And we have, I think this might be another question for you, Kaitlyn. What software are you using to process scans of photographs and negatives? And this person saying we're using Darktable and Photoshop.
Mm. It depends on you. Um, I've worked at places that were just using quite literally paint, on a PC or the standard PC photo uh, software. It depends on how much you want to be doing. Paint can very easily do an inversion for negatives. This is not the time to get too creative. No filters. You want to be very clear about what kind of changes you're making and for what reason. And because it is sort of straightforward, most photo software, even the ones that come standard, can handle the level of tweaking that you're doing. So it just depends on your budget and your what you're comfortable with, and maybe how elaborate the types of images you're working with. I mean, if it's something, sometimes people want to create like flipbook gifs and things like that. You're getting more elaborate there, and that requires more functionality.
That's great to know, Caitlin, that they don't need, nobody needs to go out and purchase a Photoshop
Nope,
license,
not for the
advanced
level that we're
Photoshop
talking about.
license right now. Yeah. Um, well, I think with that, maybe we can wrap up. Thank you so much for all these fabulous questions, everybody. Big thank you to Ivy and Caitlin for your presentations and all of your expertise today. And also to Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. And thanks again to the National Endowment for the Humanities and to all of you for showing up and for sticking around for the end of this webinar. Um, just wanted to plug, if you're in the Philly area, we have a kind of in-person, so you could say follow-up to this program, preparing collections materials for digitization. So this is going to be a hands-on workshop. We're doing at our space on September 17th. Caitlin's going to be leading that. That's part of our new workshops at the center series right here at CCHA. And if you're not in local to the area or you just want to come to another webinar, our next webinar will be New Tools to Create Dynamic Resources for Your Institution on August 11th at noon. We hope to see you there. When the program ends, there's going to be a little survey that pops up when your window closes. We'd kindly ask that you fill that out to let us know how we're doing. And with that, I think we'll say good afternoon or whatever time it might be where you're tuning in from. Thanks, everybody.